The train had not moved for days. Passengers slept in the wooden cars, waiting for the line to clear. Above them, the slope held what winter had been building since February. At 1:42 a.m., the mountain released 10 acres of snow. The train went with it. In 1910, the Great Northern Railway crossed the Cascade Range through Stevens Pass, Washington. The route connected Seattle to the interior, and the railroad operated year-round. Wellington was a small depot near the summit, built to service the line through the mountains. The town existed because trains needed coal, water, and switchmen at altitude. In late February, a passenger train and a mail train were traveling east. Heavy snow had already closed the line multiple times that winter. On February 23rd, both trains stopped at Wellington. The pass ahead was blocked. Snow removal crews were working, but additional storms continued. The trains waited. Days passed. Passengers remained on board. The alternative was to walk back down the line or stay in the small depot hotel. Most chose to stay in the heated cars. The railroad provided meals. Waiting was not unusual in mountain operations during winter. Delays of several days had occurred before. By February 28th, the trains had been stationary for 5 days. Snow continued. The rotary plows could not keep pace with accumulation. The track in front of the trains was buried under drifts. Behind them, the line back to the lowlands remained open but was also threatened. The decision was made to wait rather than reverse. Clearing forward seemed closer to resolution than retreating. The train sat on a section of track carved into the mountainside. Above the rail line, the slope rose steeply for hundreds of feet. Below, the terrain dropped into a deep valley. The trains were positioned on a narrow bench between the two. This was standard mountain railroading. The exposure was understood. The risk was considered manageable. On the night of March 1st, the weather changed. A warm wind moved through the pass. Rain began to fall on snow that had accumulated for a week. The temperature rose above freezing. The snow became heavier. Water soaked into the pack. The conditions that stabilize a snowpack were reversing. The slope above Wellington had been receiving snow since mid-February. Each storm added depth. Wind transported additional snow from exposed ridges and deposited it on the lee side of the mountain. The accumulation was not uniform. Cornices formed along the ridge. Slabs built up on steep sections. The snow that fell near the tracks was visible. The snow that loaded the slope above was not. Mountain snow does not fall and remain static. It settles, compresses, and bonds into layers. When conditions are cold and dry, these layers strengthen. When temperatures fluctuate, when rain falls on snow, or when wind loads a slope unevenly, the bond between layers weakens. The snow becomes a stacked structure under stress. Gravity applies constant pressure. The question is not whether the snow will move, but when the resistance fails. The slope above the trains was steep enough to slide. It had slid before. Avalanche paths were visible in the forest pattern, clearings where trees had been removed by previous events. The rail line had been placed on what appeared to be stable ground, but the starting zone was directly above. There was no barrier, no deflection structure, no distance between the accumulation area and the trains. By March 1st, the snowpack on the slope was approximately 10 feet deep. The warm rain added weight. Water percolated down through the layers, lubricating the interfaces between them. The snow at the surface became heavier. The snow at the base, sitting on bare ground or rock, became slicker. The entire mass was being destabilized from above and below simultaneously. No one was monitoring the slope. Avalanche science did not exist as a formal discipline in 1910. There were no forecasts, no stability tests, no protocols for assessing snowpack danger. The concept of avalanche terrain was understood in mining communities and among mountaineers, but railroad operations did not include avalanche risk assessment. The focus was on the track, keeping it clear, keeping trains moving. The slope was part of the landscape, not part of the operational picture. The trains remained stationary through the evening of March 1st. Passengers slept. Crew members stayed in their quarters. The depot was quiet. The rain continued. Somewhere above, in darkness, the load exceeded the strength. By the sixth day, waiting had become routine. Passengers read, played cards, wrote letters. Meals were served in the dining car. Children moved between cars. The railroad continued to assure everyone that the line would clear soon. There was no panic, no urgency. Discomfort, yes, frustration, but not fear. The trains were not designed for extended habitation, but they were equipped for overnight travel. Coal stoves provided heat. Sleeping berths were available. The cars were sturdy wooden structures, built to withstand the stresses of rail travel. They were not built to withstand impact from above. Some passengers had questioned the safety of staying on the trains. A few moved to the depot hotel or to nearby section houses where railroad workers lived, but most stayed. Leaving the train meant giving up warmth, food, and the certainty of being present when the line cleared. It also meant stepping into deep snow, walking in poor visibility, and finding shelter in small, crowded buildings. The train was the most comfortable option. No one ordered an evacuation. The railroad did not have protocols for moving passengers off trains that were simply delayed. The danger was understood to be ahead: blocked track, more storms, possible further delays. The danger was not understood to be above. The slope had been shedding small amounts of snow throughout the week. Sloughs, loose surface snow sliding short distances, were visible during daylight. These were considered normal. They did not reach the track. The larger question, whether the entire slope could release, was not being asked. On the evening of March 1st, the rain intensified. The temperature remained above freezing. Water ran down the slope in small channels, undermining the snowpack from within. The train sat directly below, lights on in the windows, smoke rising from the stovepipes. 96 people were inside or nearby. Most were asleep by midnight. At 1:42 a.m. on March 1st, the snowpack on Windy Mountain released. The failure began high on the slope, possibly triggered by the loss of anchoring strength in the saturated basal layers. The slab broke free and began to accelerate. Within seconds, it was moving at speeds estimated later at over 60 miles per hour. The mass, snow, ice, trees, rock, descended the slope in a dense, churning flow. There was no warning. No sound preceded it that anyone aboard the trains could have heard over the wind and rain. The avalanche struck the trains from above and behind. The leading edge of the debris flow impacted the passenger train first, then the mail train. The force was not a collision in the conventional sense. It was a transfer of vertical and horizontal momentum from a mass moving downslope at high speed. The cars did not derail. They were lifted, carried, and destroyed. The passenger train consisted of several wooden coaches and sleeper cars. The mail train included postal cars and crew quarters. All were swept off the rail and carried downslope. Some cars were pushed hundreds of feet into the valley below. Others were buried in place under debris. The wooden structures splintered, roofs separated from walls, windows shattered, stoves overturned. Fires started in some cars, then were extinguished by the wet snow. The avalanche traveled approximately a quarter mile vertically. The volume of snow involved was estimated at over 100,000 cubic yards. The depth of the debris field in the valley ranged from 10 to 40 feet. Everything in the path, trains, telegraph poles, small structures, was either destroyed or buried. The event lasted less than a minute. There was no time for passengers to react, to move, to escape. Those who survived did so because of where they were positioned inside the cars or because debris flow dynamics left small voids. Most died from trauma, impact, crushing, suffocation. Some died later from exposure or injuries sustained in the destruction. The depot building and several nearby structures were not hit. Workers and passengers who had chosen to stay off the train survived. They heard the avalanche, felt the ground shake, then saw nothing. The trains were gone. The track was buried. The slope was silent. Survivors began digging immediately. They used shovels, boards, hands. The snow was dense and heavy. Visibility was poor. The rain continued. Some survivors were pulled out within the first hour. Others remained buried. The scale of the destruction became clear slowly. This was not a derailment. This was total loss. Rescue efforts began at first light. Workers from the depot and nearby railroad camps started probing the debris field. The snow was too deep and too consolidated for rapid progress. Equipment was limited: hand shovels, poles, no machinery capable of moving large volumes of compacted snow. Every body required hours of digging. Word reached lower elevations by telegraph. Additional crews were dispatched, but reaching Wellington required clearing the line or hiking through deep snow. The first organized rescue parties arrived late on March 1st. They brought more tools, medical supplies, and experience, but the conditions remained difficult. The debris field was unstable. Secondary slides were possible. The rain continued intermittently, and temperatures fluctuated. Bodies were recovered over the next several days. Some were found near the surface. Others were buried under 15 to 20 feet of snow. The wooden train cars had been shattered, and debris was scattered across the slope. Identifying remains was difficult. Personal effects were logged. Families were notified as identifications were made. The final count was 96 dead. Survivors numbered 23. Most survivors had been in specific cars or sections of cars that were either pushed aside by the flow or ended up in positions where air pockets formed. There was no pattern that could have been predicted. Survival was a function of chance and debris dynamics. The bodies were transported down the mountain as they were recovered. Temporary morgues were established in nearby towns. Funerals were held across the region. The railroad provided compensation to families and covered funeral expenses. Investigations began immediately. The Wellington disaster changed how railroads assessed mountain operations. Prior to 1910, avalanches were considered localized hazards, manageable through track placement and snow removal. After Wellington, they were recognized as structural threats requiring engineering solutions. The Great Northern Railway began construction of avalanche sheds, reinforced concrete or timber structures built over the track in high-risk zones. These sheds were designed to allow avalanches to pass over the trains rather than impact them. The first sheds were completed within 2 years of the disaster. Eventually, miles of track through the Cascades were covered. The railroad also rerouted the line. The section of track at Wellington was abandoned. A new tunnel, longer and lower, was constructed to bypass the most dangerous slopes. The town of Wellington was renamed Ty, in part to distance the location from the disaster. The site of the avalanche was left undeveloped. Avalanche forecasting and snowpack analysis developed slowly over the following decades. By mid-century, mountain railroads and highways employed observers trained to assess snow stability. The science that would have identified the risk above Wellington in 1910 did not exist at the time, but it was developed in part because of what happened there. The disaster remains the deadliest avalanche in United States history. It is studied in avalanche safety courses, in railroad history, and in engineering programs focused on hazard mitigation. The lesson is consistent. Immobility in avalanche terrain is exposure. Weighting is not neutral, and snow that accumulates above will eventually move down.